A white shape moves across the rooftops at midnight, silent, spectral, and seen by no one who lives without regret. In a house steeped in old guilt, something has returned, not for justice, but for remembrance. This is a story of buried truths, quiet vengeance, and a mask worn not to hide, but to reveal. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a bitter February evening, when the wind curled along the chimneys like a serpent seeking entry, and the fog lay low upon Baker Street with a density that muffled even the horses' hooves, that I found myself once again at the fireside of my old friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The glow of the coals cast shifting patterns upon the Turkish rug, and Holmes, half buried in the armchair opposite, sat motionless, his long, lean fingers steepled together in the shadow beneath his chin. Outside, the gas lamps burned dim and yellow, their efforts swallowed by the oppressive London murk. The clock upon the mantel had just struck 7, and the familiar tick of its mechanism was the only sound to accompany the occasional crackle of the fire. Holmes had not spoken for some time, his gaze fixed somewhere within the flames. Yet I had learned that his silence was never idle. Some internal wheel was turning, unseen but ceaseless. As I leafed through the evening's paper, more to occupy my hands than my mind, I glanced at him and observed the faintest narrowing of his eyes, an indication I knew of mental focus. I made no inquiry, for long acquaintance had taught me that Holmes would speak when the moment warranted, and so I waited, content for now to share the quiet with him, until the outer world, as it so often did, sent forth another thread for my friend to unravel. My attention had drifted to the advertisements when I noticed Holmes rise, very slightly, and direct his gaze toward the curtained window. Without rising, he moved aside the edge of the heavy fabric with one finger and peered into the fog. Then, with the ghost of a smile curling his lips, he spoke. "We are being watched, Watson." "Watched," I echoed, setting down the paper. "Yes," he murmured, "by a man of naval bearing, recently disembarked from active duty. His gait is unsteady on the right side, an old injury, I should think, and he carries an irrational fear of felines." I stared at him, bewildered. "Holmes, I saw no one." "You would not have," he said mildly, but his outline was visible against the lamplight for a moment before he drew back. The gloved hand was the most telling. It trembled slightly, not from cold, but from suppressed anxiety. Navy-issue gloves. See the braiding on the wrist, paired with a long oilskin coat. The right glove was more worn, indicating frequent use of a cane or leaning stick. But the fear of cats? Holmes chuckled softly. "Ah, Watson, you must learn to see." His eyes, what little was visible, did not fix upon this flat, but upon the rooftop opposite. And when a tabby strayed across the eaves, he shrank back with a visible shudder. One does not recoil from a common rooftop cat unless there is a rooted aversion. The reaction was instinctive. I shook my head in mingled amazement and amusement. "And you gathered all this from a momentary glimpse?" "It is often the merest flicker that tells the tale," Holmes replied, as a knock resounded from the door below, curt, urgent, and unmistakably wrought from nervous tension. Mrs. Hudson, ever punctual despite the hour and the weather, ushered the visitor into our sitting room without delay. The man who entered was indeed dressed as Holmes had described. A naval-style coat, buttoned high to the throat, gloves clutched tightly in one hand, and the faint limp that marked his every step. He was of middling years, with silver threading his dark hair and deep lines at the corners of his mouth. His eyes darted about the room before settling uneasily on Holmes. He removed his hat with a somewhat mechanical motion, and I noted that the hand which held it trembled. "My name is Featherstone," he said, his voice low but clear. "Professor Ambrose Featherstone. I was told by a mutual acquaintance that you, Mr. Holmes, might be of assistance in matters of an unusual nature." Holmes inclined his head without rising. "Pray be seated, Professor Featherstone. I find unusual matters to be the most revealing." Featherstone lowered himself into the chair across from us and clasped his hands tightly, as though to steady them. "I do not know what to make of it," he began, "but someone seeks to unnerve me, and I believe it may be working." Holmes studied our guest with an intensity that rendered words unnecessary. His fingers, once again steepled beneath his chin, gave no sign of restlessness. At length, he spoke in a tone low and detached. "You do not fear the darkness, Professor," he said, "but you do fear what might pace within it." Featherstone blinked, taken aback. "Cats, in particular," Holmes added, "hold a peculiar place in your unease. Am I correct?" The professor gave a start, his lips parting in unspoken surprise. How could you possibly know?" Holmes merely nodded. "You are not the first, nor shall you be the last, to be stalked by ghosts dressed in fur and silence." I turned toward him with a question forming on my lips, but Holmes stood abruptly and turned to the fire. "Watson," he said, "you may wish to keep your pen close. I suspect this tale shall be a curious one." Professor Ambrose Featherstone, though a man of scholarly bearing, entered our sitting room with the air of one pursued by a shadow too long entertained. There was a certain stoop to his posture, not born of age but of some internal weight, as though his very spine had bowed under the strain of private misgivings. His gaze flickered across Holmes, then myself, and settled with uncertainty on the Persian carpet beneath his feet. He wore a wool coat frayed at the cuffs and bore the scent of old books and damp air. Removing his gloves with slow, deliberate motion, he seated himself upon the Holmes's invitation. Though I noted he kept his overcoat buttoned to the collar, as though some inner chill could not be dislodged by fire alone. "You are troubled," Holmes said without preamble. "And the nature of your trouble is neither legal nor financial, but psychological, and of recent escalation." Featherstone's brow furrowed. "How?" "There is ink on the inner cuff of your left sleeve," Holmes replied evenly. "From your own pen, not a secretary's. Yet your right hand bears the callus of habitual penmanship, indicating a period of recent and solitary note-taking. Such behaviour is often seen in those attempting to make sense of events they do not understand." Featherstone offered no protest to the observation. Rather, he sighed, a long, slow exhalation of weariness, and with a tremor in his voice, began the account that had brought him out into the fog that night. "My home," he began, "is a townhouse on a quiet street in Chelsea, passed down through 3 generations. It is neither grand nor decrepit, yet for some months now I have felt it turn against me." Holmes raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "It began with misplaced items, small things at first. A letter I was certain I had sealed vanished from my desk. A volume of Milton reappeared in the parlour after being shelved in my study. Attributing it to absent-mindedness, I paid it little mind." His fingers interlaced, and I noted how tightly he gripped them. But then came the notes, unsigned, anonymous scraps of paper slipped beneath the door or into my jacket pocket. Messages written in an unsteady hand, always brief. "You cannot bury what watches," read one. "It remembers the fire," said another. "A pattern?" Holmes asked quietly. "They arrive only on Thursday evenings." "And the most peculiar element?" Holmes prompted, though it was clear he already anticipated it. Featherstone hesitated. "It is a cat, Mr. Holmes, a white one. Each night at precisely midnight, it appears upon the rooftop opposite my bedroom window. Not once, but regularly. It paces, stops, and looks directly into the room, as though watching me. "You live alone?" I asked. "Save for Mrs. Tilling, my housekeeper of many years, yes. She too has seen the creature. Once she swore it was not a cat at all, but a child on all fours cloaked in white." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And what do you believe it to be, Professor?" Featherstone looked down. "I no longer trust my own certainty, sir." There was something in his tone that unsettled me. I could not name it precisely, but it was not fear alone. It was the quiet surrender of a man beginning to doubt the borders of his own reason. It was only when Holmes fell silent, folding his arms across his chest in consideration, that I ventured to ask, "Professor, has anything in your past occurred which might give rise to this haunting?" Featherstone hesitated. It was the sort of pause not born of forgetfulness, but of deliberation. "There is something," he admitted, voice low, though I had not intended to speak of it. "Not unless absolutely necessary." Holmes inclined his head. "That threshold may already be crossed, Professor." Featherstone sighed. 20 years ago, my younger brother Julian died in an asylum near Exeter. He had been admitted following what was described as a nervous collapse, though the truth was more complicated. He turned toward the fire, as if seeking absolution in its light. There was contention over an inheritance. The family estate, such as it was, passed to me through legal channels, though it had once been promised to Julian by our father. Julian believed I had manipulated the documents. The accusation broke him. "And did you?" Holmes asked softly. Featherstone did not reply at once. When he did, it was with a faint tremor. "I believed I acted within my rights, but the burden of what is lawful and what is just has grown heavier with time." Watson's pen stilled. The confession had changed the room. "And now," Featherstone whispered, "I fear the past seeks payment." Holmes leaned forward then, and I recognized the gleam in his eye that signaled not merely interest, but something deeper, a stirring of intellectual fascination, often masked by his detached demeanor. "You mentioned the creature appears each night at the same hour," he said. "Always the same rooftop, always the same behavior." "Yes," Featherstone replied, "and always when I am alone in my study." "There is nothing more suggestive than a pattern dressed as coincidence," Holmes murmured. "This is no ordinary visitation." He stood, walking to the window and drawing the curtain just enough to survey the street beyond. "Chelsea is no stranger to theatrics, but to sustain such precision, to evoke a fear rather than merely startle, requires more than mischief. It requires purpose." Featherstone's eyes narrowed. "Then you will assist me?" Holmes turned from the window. "I shall begin this evening, if you permit. Dr. Watson and I will call at your home tomorrow morning. We shall see whether the white cat is flesh, phantasm, or something altogether more insidious." The professor inclined his head. "You have my gratitude." Holmes offered no reply. But I knew the case had taken hold of him, as surely as that white shape had gripped the mind of Ambrose Featherstone. We arrived at Professor Featherstone's residence the following morning, the fog having lifted, but leaving behind a residue of dampness that clung to one's coat and collar. The house itself stood midway down a narrow terrace in Chelsea, an austere Georgian structure whose symmetry lent it an air of quiet dignity, though the ivy creeping up its east wall had begun to choke rather than adorn. Holmes paused before the door, casting a slow gaze across the facade. His eye lingered on the uppermost window, then drifted to the adjoining roofs. "You will note, Watson," he murmured, "that the chimneys along this row are unusually low, and the eaves, broad enough for even a man to traverse with caution." I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. a narrow corridor of slate that connected the rooftops like a discreet passage above the world. The bell was answered promptly by Mrs. Tilling, a matronly woman with a pinched expression that had likely not softened since her youth. She welcomed us with a stiff nod and led us inside. Within, the house bore the musty scent of old paper and quiet lives. The drawing room was sparse but orderly, every item in its proper place. And yet I could not shake the sensation, irrational though it seemed, that something watched from behind the walls, or just beyond the turn of a door. Holmes removed his gloves and surveyed the room in silence. Then, turning to Mrs. Tilling with that air of courteous gravity he reserved for cooperative witnesses, he said, "If you would be so good, madam, we would like to begin with your own recollections." She nodded stiffly, gesturing us toward a high-backed chair near the hearth. Her account, when it came, was more revealing than either of us had anticipated. "I have served the professor near 12 years, Mrs. Tilling began, her hands folded firmly in her lap. "And never in all that time have I known him to be disturbed by dreams or dark thoughts. Until 3 months ago." Holmes leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what changed?" "The house, sir. Or rather, its manner. Doors began opening of their own accord. I'd shut the study window tight, only to find it ajar within the hour. The coal scuttle overturned itself more than once. At first, I dismissed it as my own distraction. But then came the fire." "Fire?" I inquired. "Not a blaze," she clarified, "but the scent. I'd catch it, always faint, always in the morning, burnt paper, as though someone had fed a single sheet to the grate in secret." Holmes stood, drifted toward the hearth, and crouched by the iron grate without touching it. His eyes scanned the bricks and surrounding rug. "And the cat?" he asked. Her hands clenched slightly. "The white thing? I saw it once, sir. Only once. It perched on the sill outside the third-floor landing, perfectly still, watching." "Was it large?" Holmes asked without turning. "Too large for a house cat, I'd say, and its eyes glowed like lamps in the dusk. I'll not pretend it didn't give me a turn." Holmes rose slowly. "You say it perched. How high above ground?" 30 feet, near enough," she replied. "And did it vanish?" She hesitated. "Not so much vanished, sir, as crept away. It moved oddly. Not like a cat, more like a person mimicking one." Holmes gave no comment, but I noticed the way his fingers tapped once, twice against his leg. His customary signal that a piece had shifted on the mental chessboard. Holmes requested a poker, and upon receiving it, knelt once again before the fireplace. With careful precision, he disturbed the grate's lower edge, drawing out a portion of the ash that had collected beneath. Within moments, he had uncovered what he sought, a fragment of scorched parchment, its edges curled and brittle, the writing upon it half consumed. He laid it gently upon the desk and gestured for me to examine it. The ink, though faded, still bore traces of Latin phrasing, animus fractus est, and beside it, in the margins, what appeared to be hand-drawn sigils or symbols. Some were reminiscent of alchemical shorthand, others more archaic, almost monastic in nature. Holmes retrieved a small magnifying lens from his inner pocket and studied the markings in silence. "This was not an accident," he remarked. "It was a deliberate offering to the fire, just enough to render it fragmentary, but not so thorough as to destroy its meaning entirely." "Then the message was meant to be found?" I asked. "Or feared," he replied. "In either case, it tells us the intruder is not merely toying with the professor, but understands precisely how to press upon the edges of his rationality." He held the parchment toward the light. "Note the symbols. These are not drawn by a scholar's hand. They lack academic detachment. No, Watson, this is the script of someone obsessed." The air in the room felt colder then. though the fire had not dimmed. A certain atmosphere had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, as though the house itself had exhaled something long held. Our investigation soon turned upward. With Featherstone's permission, Holmes requested access to the roof, and we ascended by means of a narrow staircase, terminating in a hatch above the third-floor corridor. The wind met us with a hollow whisper as we stepped out onto the slates, the morning mist still clinging to the eaves. Holmes moved like a man accustomed to uneven ground, his step sure despite the treacherous pitch of the roof. He crouched near the chimney stack that overlooked the professor's study and examined the joint between tile and lead flashing. "Here," he murmured. I knelt beside him. Lodged between two cracked tiles was a fine white strand, short, curved, unmistakably a hair. "Cat fur?" I asked. He shook his head. "Too coarse for that, and the taper of the end suggests trimming, not shedding. Human, I suspect, possibly a wig or theatrical disguise." He stood and surveyed the adjoining rooftops. The width of this span, the angles of the eaves. Yes, quite feasible. For what? For someone to cross these roofs without detection. The creature, or rather the figure that Mrs. Tilling saw. He paused, then added, "Was no beast, but a person in costume. The fur is planted, or worn, as part of a deliberate masquerade. We are dealing with no apparition, Watson. We are dealing with artifice, executed with care." I glanced down at the professor's bedroom window far below, imagining the silent white presence, perched and watching. The effect, I realized, would be utterly chilling. And perhaps, Holmes suggested, that was precisely the point. The light in the study had begun to dim with the afternoon, but Holmes showed no inclination to leave. While he continued his quiet examination of the rooftop alignment through the window, I occupied myself with the professor's papers, at Featherstone's own suggestion. He had grown weary and had retired briefly to his chamber, trusting us, as he said, with whatever truth may yet be waiting in the dust. Amongst the correspondence and estate ledgers neatly arranged in a mahogany cabinet, I came upon a blue document folder marked Testament Revised. Inside was a freshly drawn will, dated less than a fortnight past, its ink still vibrant, its language unmistakably final. What drew my attention, however, was not the will's legal content, though clear and concisely drafted, but the sole beneficiary named within it, Miss Beatrice Lorne. The name was unfamiliar to me, and I turned to Holmes, who had not ceased his quiet inspection of the rooftops. "Holmes," I said, "the professor's estate has been left in its entirety to a Miss Beatrice Lorne." Holmes turned his head, a slight flicker of interest passing over his features. "Indeed. A family relation." The attached affidavit, signed by Featherstone's solicitor, described her as a relative by blood, recently acknowledged. "A niece, it seems," I said. "Estranged, then suddenly restored," Holmes murmured. "A pattern not uncommon in those who suspect time is no longer their ally." He turned back to the window, tapping once upon the sill. "Let us hope, Watson, that this niece is not the sort who waits for midnight to inherit. By Holmes's arrangement, we remained at the house until midnight. The professor had retired early, citing fatigue, and Mrs. Tilling had been sent to her quarters with the assurance that no further disturbances would require her attention. Holmes and I occupied the drawing room. Its gas lamp dimmed, a small chink in the curtains allowing a sliver of moonlight to paint a narrow line across the carpet. Holmes sat with his eyes half closed, yet I knew him to be as alert as any watchman. I, for my part, struggled with drowsiness, which was finally banished at the stroke of 12 by a subtle but electric change in the air. One of those intuitive sensations, like the stillness that precedes a storm. Holmes rose without a sound and gestured for me to follow. We moved to the third-floor landing and stationed ourselves in the shadowed corridor just beyond the bedroom. Holmes pointed toward the window, and there, upon the opposite rooftop, it stood. The cat, or the figure, was utterly white, almost luminous in the moonlight. It crouched low against the chimney and began to move along the ridge with a slinking, unnatural grace. It made no sound, not the scrape of a claw, not the padding of fur upon slate. Even in stillness, a real animal produces breath, rustle, some whisper of life. But this creature, though moving, was as silent as snow. Holmes studied it intensely. "Note the gait," he whispered. "Calculated, measured, not instinctive, but rehearsed. Not a cat, then?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Watson, this is a performance, and whoever dons that guise does so to terrify, efficiently and with purpose." The figure paused at the far eave, turned its head slowly toward the window, toward us, and then vanished behind the chimney stack. The following morning found us at King's College, where Holmes had arranged a meeting with Professor Eli Barkston, formerly a colleague of Featherstone's and, as we would learn, a man both brilliant and embittered. Barkston was a tall, gaunt figure with a jaw set in permanent disapproval and a voice that rarely rose above a rasping monotone. He greeted us stiffly in his book-laden study and responded to our inquiries with a mixture of irritation and disdain. Ambrose Featherstone, he said, was a man more fortunate than deserving. He ascended upon polished shoes and published ideas not always his own. If he is now plagued by ghostly cats, I'd call it a late tax upon stolen scholarship. Holmes remained impassive. "You suggest plagiarism?" "I suggest many things," Barkston replied coldly. "But alas, the Academy has no ghost hunters. I, for one, have left such quarrels behind." "And your whereabouts the night before last?" Holmes inquired. "At home," Barkston said tersely. "Marking dissertations. I keep my life dull by design." There was nothing overtly incriminating in his words, yet the bitterness with which they were spoken left an impression, not of guilt, but of festering wounds. We took our leave shortly thereafter, with Holmes saying little, though his eyes, I could tell, had gleaned more than his words betrayed. As we walked the long corridor out of King's College, I turned to Holmes with my customary question. "You don't believe him guilty?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "No, Watson. Barkston is too proud to resort to disguise. His vengeance, if he were to seek it, would be penned in a journal, not acted upon beneath the moonlight." "Then why the visit?" "To eliminate him or retain him as a player," Holmes said. "One must sometimes lay aside the obvious rogue to reveal the concealed hand." "And do you believe we are nearer that hand?" He paused before descending the stairwell, his gaze distant. "The pattern is forming. There is orchestration behind these events, not the random cruelty of a lunatic, but the composed effort of someone with memory, motive, and a gift for theatre." He did not smile, but a curious light entered his eyes. "And you know how I admire a well-staged illusion." It was a little after 4 in the morning when a furious knocking roused me from my slumber. Holmes, already partially dressed, had anticipated the summons and opened the door before I had fully risen. The messenger, a pale-footed constable from the Chelsea beat, handed Holmes a scrawled note, damp with fog and haste. Without a word, Holmes tossed me my overcoat and cane, and we departed at once. Professor Featherstone had been found unconscious at the foot of his staircase. When we arrived, Mrs. Tilling met us in a flurry of distress. The professor, she explained, had not come down for his tea, and upon investigating, she had discovered him crumpled at the base of the steps, his head resting against the newel post, a trickle of blood drying at his temple. A local physician had been summoned. Featherstone's pulse had been faint but steady, and he now lay, unconscious but stable, in his bedroom. Holmes wasted no time. He bent over the banister rail, his eyes sharp and alert, and then descended slowly, examining each step with meticulous care. "The fall appears natural," the constable offered, "though a nasty one. No sign of forced entry." Holmes said nothing at first, but as I observed the delicate tension in his features, I understood that he was not satisfied. He crouched to examine a rug askew at the base of the stairs, and I noticed the faint narrowing of his eyes. "Natural," he repeated quietly, "is the most convenient disguise of all." We were shown to the professor's side briefly, and though his injuries were not grave, the bruising on the crown of his head was deeply troubling. It seemed that someone wished to hasten Featherstone's end, but to do so with the gentlest nudge of inevitability. Holmes remained behind after the constable had taken his leave, and while I sat briefly at the professor's bedside, watching the shallow rhythm of his breath, Holmes once more turned his attention to the staircase. The steps were narrow and varnished, but their wear was uneven, something Holmes noted with a touch of his cane. He bent low at the 4th stair, then again at the 7th. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The dust along these edges, undisturbed in most places, save for a curious scuff here, at the 7th rise. Do you see how the mark breaks backward, not downward?" I leaned in and noted the irregularity. "As if he were pulled, not fell?" "Or rather," Holmes replied, "as if he turned sharply mid-step, instinctively, perhaps in surprise." He traced a finger along the banister rail. "And here, the faint oil left by a gloved hand, recent, Featherstone may have reached but not grasped." He stepped back, surveying the entire stairwell from the base upward. "The placement of the rug is suggestive, not merely shifted by the fall, but already askew, laid perhaps with purpose." "You believe this was no accident?" I said quietly. Holmes glanced at me sidelong. "I believe someone prefers the veil of accident to the risk of accusation." We returned to the study and Holmes paused before the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The timing is instructive," he murmured. "Something has quickened the game, and the next move, I suspect, shall be more direct still." With Featherstone confined to his chamber and Mrs. Tilling attending to his recovery, Holmes and I resumed our quiet inspection of the study. I took it upon myself to gather several of the books that had been scattered across the professor's desk and replace them on their respective shelves, an act born partly of orderliness and partly, I admit, of curiosity. It was while returning a well-worn edition of Dante's Inferno that I felt the unnatural weight within the pages. A folded envelope, yellowed and brittle at the seams, had been pressed between the cantos and left undisturbed. I withdrew it carefully and called to Holmes. He examined the exterior with interest. No seal, no address, likely meant to be found. He opened the letter and unfolded the paper inside. Its contents were written in a bold, sweeping hand, Italian by the look of it, and stained along the edges as though once dampened by fire or careless hands. Holmes read it silently, his lips moving faintly. His brow furrowed deeper with each line. "May I?" I asked. "In time," he murmured. "It is a curious document, Watson. Its message is more veiled than direct, yet no less potent." He turned the paper over. The ink bleeds in places, suggesting haste, emotion. The language is metaphorical, but charged. What does it say? Holmes folded the letter slowly. "Let us sit. I shall translate it for you." I watched him take a seat in the armchair opposite, the paper still trembling faintly between his fingers. Whatever ghost had written it, it spoke in the language of vengeance. Holmes held the letter between thumb and forefinger, the creases folding inward like the edges of a blade. "It reads," he began, his voice level but distant. "There are debts that cannot be measured in coin or time. There are wrongs that echo beyond the grave. To the one who watched and did nothing, know that silence does not erase fire. The blood that was spilt has remembered its name." He looked up. Then, unsigned. No further identifiers. I let out a low breath. The tone is personal and damning. Indeed, Holmes replied. It speaks not only to guilt, but to conscience. The writer has suffered a long grievance, nurtured it, preserved it. And the fire? I asked. Holmes gave a slow nod. The fire in which Julian Featherstone perished, no doubt. The letter revives it not merely as tragedy, but as accusation. He stood and placed the letter in the professor's desk drawer. We now possess motive, Watson, or rather, the shadow of one. Whether our adversary seeks retribution, exposure, or inheritance remains unclear. But one truth emerges unmistakably. This is not madness. It is orchestration. He turned to me with that particular gleam in his eye which heralded new momentum. And I should very much like to meet the cast of this performance before the curtain rises again. The following afternoon, as Holmes and I sat reviewing the contents of Featherstone's study for a second time, the doorbell rang, with a tone both brisk and unapologetic. Mrs. Tilling announced the arrival of a Miss Beatrice Lorne. The name brought Holmes to his feet. She entered with quiet poise, a tall and well-composed woman of perhaps 30, with a bearing that spoke of education and independence. Her attire was tasteful, her voice low and steady, and her gaze clear, intelligent, and watchful. I received word that my uncle had suffered a fall, she said, and I thought it best to attend. Holmes introduced himself, and I rose to offer my greeting. You have not long known of your relation to Professor Featherstone? Holmes asked. She smiled faintly. Only recently. I was adopted as an infant and grew up under another name. Upon discovering certain records, I traced my bloodline here, and the professor was kind enough to acknowledge it. Your presence here is timely, Holmes observed, fortuitous even. She met his gaze without flinching. I had no hand in his fall, Mr. Holmes. I have come only to understand my heritage. Nothing more. Holmes did not respond at once, but I saw in his expression a flicker of curiosity, not doubt precisely, but calculation. Holmes requested a private word, and Miss Lorne consented with a nod. They withdrew to the corner of the study while I busied myself with Featherstone's library, straining to remain respectfully inattentive, though my ears could not help but wander. Holmes began gently. You are familiar, then, with the details of Professor Featherstone's estate? To a degree, she replied. He informed me that his original will had been altered in my favour. I did not request it, nor have I seen it. You were his only remaining family. So he claimed, she said, though I suspect he meant only the family he dared acknowledge. Holmes inclined his head. You do not speak with fondness. She gave a cool smile. Affection does not always follow blood, Mr. Holmes, nor does blood excuse the past. There was no bitterness in her tone, only detachment, as though she were reciting a line from a play well rehearsed. Holmes studied her with quiet intensity. You believe the professor capable of wrong? I believe all men are, she replied. At that, Holmes thanked her and escorted her to the door. She left with a final glance toward the stairwell, neither hurried nor hesitant. As the door closed behind Miss Lorne, Holmes stood in thoughtful silence, his eyes still fixed upon the empty corridor. She plays her role well, I remarked. Holmes gave a small nod. Almost too well. You doubt her? I doubt what she withholds, he replied. Emotion speaks in its absence as much as in its presence. And Miss Lorne is composed to the edge of calculation. He turned slowly toward the window, where the light of late afternoon stretched across the rooftops like a faded warning. This is no longer a question of inheritance, Watson, he said. It is a question of history rewritten in the shadows. It was late the following day when a knock brought us to the door once more. This time it was a neighbour, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Aldworth, stooped by years, but keen-eyed and steady in his manner. He had come of his own accord, having heard of the professor's accident. "There's something I feel I ought to mention," he said to Holmes, his voice low and deliberate. "Might be nothing, but it gave me a turn." Holmes inclined his head. "Please continue." "It was the night before the fall," Aldworth said. "I couldn't sleep. My leg troubles me in the cold, and I often sit by the window. I happened to glance up, and there, across the rooftop, I saw a figure in white. Not a cat, mind you, but a person." He paused. "They were crawling. The movement was unnatural, too smooth for a man, too purposeful for a beast, cloaked in white, as if to look like something else." "Where did the figure go?" Holmes asked. "Toward the chimney nearest your bedroom window," Aldworth told him. "Then it vanished." Holmes thanked the man gravely, and when the door was closed, he turned to me with that quiet intensity I had come to know well. "The phantom walks," he said, "and it walks with intent." That night, Holmes and I resumed our vigil in the corridor adjoining the professor's bedchamber. The gas was extinguished, save for a single candle, its flame barely a whisper against the dark. Midnight approached, and silence reigned. Then Holmes touched my sleeve. There, across the roof once more, it emerged. The white figure crept from the chimney's edge, low and gliding. Moonlight traced its movements, but not even the faintest rustle reached our ears. It did not pause. It did not sniff, nor peer, nor stretch as an animal might. Its purpose was unwavering: to pass in view, to be seen, and to unsettle. Holmes observed in stillness, his brow furrowed. "Do you see?" he whispered. "No hesitation at the edge, no flinch at the gap between slates, and above all, no sound. It is not moving by instinct but by design." I felt a coldness gather at my spine. "Then we are not watching a beast." "No, Watson," Holmes murmured. "We are watching an actor." At that, the figure halted, turned slowly, and faced the window as it had before. But this time, Holmes did not wait. He was already moving, silently, swiftly, toward the servants' stairs and upward into the attic, with a purpose as singular as the phantom's own. Holmes vanished with such quiet speed that I had barely reached the stairwell before his tread faded above me. I followed as quickly as I dared, ascending the narrow steps that led to the house's upper reaches. The air was stale, and the boards creaked faintly beneath my feet, though I did my utmost to mute them. By the time I reached the attic hatch, Holmes had pried it open. I joined him just as he stepped onto the roof, where the slates gleamed under a veiled moon. He motioned for silence and advanced along the ledge like a shadow. Then, a flicker. The white figure darted along the rooftop ridge, the trailing fabric of its guise catching the wind like a veil. Holmes pursued, silent and sure, until the figure slipped behind the chimney stack from which it had first emerged. Holmes rounded the structure and stopped. He knelt and examined the bricks with practiced fingers. Then he beckoned. There, cleverly hidden behind the chimney's rear, was a wooden panel worn with time but recently disturbed. Holmes applied pressure, and with a soft groan, it gave way to reveal a narrow entrance, a concealed crawl space leading downward into the attic. He met my eye. "It was never about escape," he said. "It was about return." The passage opened into a forgotten recess of the attic, thick with dust but marked by curious signs of recent occupation. We stepped carefully, our footsteps muffled by the layer of age-softened insulation beneath. And then we saw it. Nestled against the far wall was a strange arrangement, neither storage nor sleeping space, but something altogether more disturbing. An old writing desk, its surface scratched and ink-stained, stood beside a single straight-backed chair. Upon the desk were 2 candlesticks, burnt to the nub, and an open book whose pages were filled with dense, erratic script. Above the desk pinned with rusting nails, were a series of photographs, sepia portraits, faded but still legible. Among them, unmistakably, was a younger Professor Featherstone, his arm about a pale, narrow-faced boy. On a crate near the chair sat a delicate silver collar, too ornate for an animal, almost theatrical in appearance, and beside it scraps of white fur. Not naturally shed, but cut. But it was the wall itself that held our gaze. Carved into the wood, deep and deliberate, were repeated lines, over and over, in a trembling hand. He left him to burn. He left him to burn. Holmes was silent, his eyes fixed not on the desk, but on the open book. Obsession, he said at last. Preserved, cultivated, like some dark plant in the attic of the mind. He stepped back, surveying the room as a whole. This is no mere hideaway, Watson. It is a shrine, to memory, to blame. And somewhere, I knew, to vengeance. Holmes moved to the desk and gingerly lifted the open book. It was a journal bound in black leather, its edges scorched as though it had once come perilously close to fire. The entries within were dated erratically, with years missing and entire pages torn free. But what remained was damning. In wavering script, its author chronicled a descent, a journey from silence to grief, from grief to fury. Each entry repeated a singular theme: abandonment, injustice, a madness forged in the crucible of loss. I watched them leave, Holmes read aloud. I screamed and screamed, but he never turned. He left me there, in the dark, and the dark caught fire. He turned a page. They say madness is born of weakness, but mine is not madness. It is memory. I remember everything. Holmes closed the journal gently. There is no signature, he said, but the voice is unmistakable. I swallowed. Julian. He nodded. Or his legacy. Whether these were his words or those of another written in his name remains to be seen. But the language is intimate, familial. Someone has carried his torment forward. Holmes looked toward the attic hatch. And they have chosen this house and this roof to speak it aloud. We descended into the study once more, the weight of what we had seen pressing upon us like a second fog. Holmes spoke little until we reached the fire. Then he turned, his gaze level. Watson, the white cat was never a cat at all. It was symbol and strategy, its form chosen not for stealth, but for spectacle. A disguise, I asked, and then, through the crevice of the attic door, Holmes would later tell me, the figure emerged. It did not rush. It did not stumble. Rather, it entered as if returning to a place it knew well, a ghost reclaiming its shrine. The figure was clad again in white, not the flowing fur of an animal, but a cloak fastened tightly about the shoulders. The mask, fashioned with feline cunning, hid all trace of humanity, save for the hands, which trembled only once as they touched the edge of the desk. Holmes remained utterly still. The figure moved to the photographs, its breath quickening. It reached for the silver collar, then hesitated, as though caught between ritual and rupture. It turned slightly, glancing toward the journal. Holmes noted the stillness in that moment. No performance now, no theatrics, only the raw ache of returning. The figure stepped closer, bent low over the journal, and began to turn a page. That was when Holmes rose, swift and silent as a drawn blade. He said nothing, and yet the figure froze, caught not by force, but by recognition. The figure made no attempt to flee. Instead, it stood, slowly lowering the mask, its breath escaping in a quiet, measured exhale. Miss Beatrice Lorne. She did not speak at first, nor did Holmes. They remained facing one another across the desk, where old words still lay, half burned, half preserved, like the grief that had driven them here. When at last she spoke, her voice was low and without tremor. So it ends. Holmes stepped forward, removing the cloak with delicate hands, not in triumph, but in reverence. You did not come to kill him, he said. No, she answered, only to remind him, and to watch the reminder grow. You forged a ghost, Holmes murmured, one that matched his guilt. She looked at the collar in her hands. He left my father to rot. While he climbed staircases of praise and position, my father whispered to brick walls. Julian's words, Holmes said quietly, or your own? A mixture, she replied. He left journals. They were incoherent, madness, they said. But I read them. I read between them. Her face, though resolute, bore the shadow of exhaustion. Did you push him? Holmes asked gently. She hesitated. Number I called him. He came to the stairs. I stood above. I wore the mask. He slipped. Watson arrived then, and I saw in Holmes's expression not pity, but comprehension. You manipulated symbols, not knives, but the outcome, I know, she said. He lives. That is punishment enough. Holmes nodded, and with that the ghost vanished, not in smoke, but in truth, laid bare by reason. Miss Beatrice Lorne stood motionless in the attic, the mask now hanging from her fingers, her white cloak trailing about her like the remnants of a vanishing illusion. Her breath was steady, her face pale but composed, and in that moment of stillness, I was struck not by the presence of guilt, but by the unmistakable absence of fear. Holmes did not advance upon her, nor did he speak immediately. He merely stood, a figure of absolute calm, and looked at her not as one would regard a criminal, but as a reader might study the final, long-withheld page of a tragic novel. You are not his niece, he said at last, his tone almost gentle. You are his brother's daughter. Her expression did not change. She neither confirmed nor denied, but allowed the silence to bear the weight of the truth. Julian Featherstone died in obscurity, Holmes continued, committed, forgotten, erased, but he left behind more than grief. He left you. Beatrice's eyes met his, unflinching, and you chose to become a symbol, the ghost he never mourned. I did, she said, her voice low, because no one else would. I felt a slow, cold ache settle in my chest, not of danger, but of recognition. The lines Holmes had traced in reason were now etched across the floor in something deeper. And though we stood in the attic of a house long steeped in fear, it was no longer fear that held sway. It was memory and reckoning. I was born under another name, she said. Raised in a grey town by a woman who gave me food and silence, but never truth. It was only when I turned 16 that I began to find the pieces. Letters, records, fragments of stories that pointed to someone else, someone lost, someone erased. Holmes listened without interruption. I remained at the edge of the room, unwilling to disturb the unfolding confession. I followed the trail through archives, sanitarium records, university annals. Slowly, the shape of him returned to me. My father, not dead in fire, but buried in madness. And at the centre of it all, one name stood out, Ambrose Featherstone. You discovered the connection, Holmes said. Yes. And when I traced the line further, I found that he had rewritten history. No brother, no inheritance, nothing but silence, as if Julian had never lived. She drew in a breath. And then I found my father's writings. Chaotic, yes, fragmented, but within them, a voice remained, a memory preserved in pain. Holmes stepped closer. And you took his voice for your own? She looked up. No, Mr. Holmes, I gave it form. And in that moment I understood, not merely vengeance, but resurrection had driven her. I watched him, she continued, and for months. I walked the same streets, attended his lectures, studied the man who had reduced my father to dust. He seemed so content, so insulated. Her voice did not tremble, but there was weight behind every word, like iron carefully forged rather than hammered in anger. I realized he feared only one thing, being exposed, not to scandal or courtrooms, but to memory. He had buried the past so completely that its return would undo him. She turned her gaze toward the photographs pinned to the attic wall. So I became what he feared, a whisper, a shape, a presence. I trained my mind as carefully as he had trained his reputation. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but his silence invited more. I studied movement, anatomy. I read histories of fear. I learned how to step where weight would not betray me. I mapped this house from rooftop to stair, and I waited. She looked down at her hands. He had chosen to forget. I chose to remind. I saw then that hers was no blind fury. It was the execution of a philosophy. Cold, deliberate, and driven by a grief too long silenced. And Holmes, for all his rational brilliance, offered no argument in reply. "I found the cat in a market off Whitechapel," she said. "A white Persian, silent, aloof, unnaturally still. She took to the rooftops as though she'd been born there." She glanced toward the narrow window where the night still lingered at the edge of dawn. "I trained her with food and timing. She came when called, left when dismissed, and to the professor's tired eyes, she became something else, a spirit, an omen." Holmes folded his arms. "You let him believe his guilt had summoned her." Beatrice nodded. "He already feared what he had buried. I merely gave that fear a face." She reached into the folds of her cloak and produced the small silver collar, its surface etched with the letter J. He saw her, and in her, he saw my father. Holmes regarded the collar for a long moment before speaking. "And so the cat became his ghost, but the true phantom," he said softly, "was you." Holmes remained composed as he asked the final question. "Did you intend to harm him?" Beatrice's expression did not falter. "Number not at first." She stepped closer to the journal upon the desk, her fingers grazing its warped cover. "I wrote the letter he found that morning. I forged the handwriting to resemble my father's. I let it slip from the pages of Dante." "And the night he fell," Holmes prompted. "I sent another note, told him Julian would return, that the rooftop would speak. I stood in the hallway. I wore the mask. When he emerged, I was already at the top of the stairs." Her voice dropped. "He saw me. He gasped. He stepped back." She paused. "That was all." "You did not lay hands upon him?" "Number. But I watched him fall. I did nothing to stop it." Holmes was silent for a long moment. "And now?" She exhaled. "He survived. That is enough. He will live to fear memory's return." Holmes nodded. "And what will you do?" Beatrice looked past us, toward the dawn. "Disappear, as he once disappeared my father." And with that, she turned, no longer the phantom in white, but a woman who had carried grief like a flame and left her vengeance smouldering in its ashes. We returned to Baker Street late the following day, the strange affair in Chelsea having reached what could only be called its moral conclusion. The fog had lifted, though the streets retained a dampness, as if London herself had absorbed some fragment of the unease we had left behind. Holmes, as was his custom after a case of emotional gravity, retreated not to rest, but to reflection. He sank into his armchair by the fire, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin, his gaze fixed somewhere in the space between flame and thought. I too felt the weight of the past days, the masked nights, the voices from attic shadows, and above all the peculiar grief of Miss Beatrice Lorne. The matter had been, in one sense, resolved. And yet resolution, I had learned, did not always wear the garb of peace. After some time, Holmes stirred. "It is a rare thing," he said quietly, "to encounter a crime where each act is both a wound and a confession." He rose and moved to the desk, drawing forth the single page from Julian Featherstone's journal we had brought back. He placed it beneath the lamp. "She needed her uncle to remember," he said. "But the tragedy is that he had spent years teaching himself to forget." I nodded, but remained silent. The truth had been laid bare, but it had not been comfortable. And Holmes, I noted, was not yet finished drawing the final contours of its shadow. Holmes remained by the hearth, the flickering light dancing across his features in thoughtful rhythm. He reached for his pipe, but left it unlit, an uncommon gesture for a man whose habits rarely varied without cause. "The cat," he began, "was real, yes. But it was also emblematic, chosen with care, cultivated in silence, and used with precision. I recalled the white Persian, silent, spectral, its movement too deliberate to be natural. She selected it, not for companionship," Holmes continued, "but for symbol. A white cat is not a common stray in Chelsea, nor does it pass unnoticed upon a rooftop. To the professor, it became a harbinger, his guilt, given clause." I nodded, and the silence of it, that was what unsettled him most. Indeed, a soundless creature, appearing nightly, became a mirror. Featherstone projected his conscience upon it, and each midnight visit was a sermon of memory. He turned to face me fully. "It is the most effective manipulation I have seen in years, Watson. Not forged from violence, but from narrative, from understanding how fear lives in the mind." "A living symbol," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and in such cases, the mind becomes its own haunted house." Holmes moved to the window and stood a moment with his back to the fire. "There is an artistry," he said, "to what Miss Lorne accomplished, an artistry rooted in sorrow but no less deliberate. She studied him," I added, "as closely as you might study a criminal pattern." "More so," Holmes corrected softly. "She studied his silences, his daily habits, his fears, especially those unspoken. She understood that men of intellect often shield themselves with reason, and so she chose a method that would erode that shield rather than attack it." He paused. "The letters, fragmented, poetic, drawn from forgotten languages, the scent of burnt paper, the rearranged objects, all subtle dislocations of a world he believed perfectly ordered. And the journals," I added, "placed in view at the precise moment she needed him to believe his past was returning." "Exactly," Holmes said. "It was not madness she incited. It was doubt. And doubt, in a man like Featherstone, is a chisel that works inward." He returned to his chair and sat, fingers once more steepled. "She never intended to kill him with her hands. She hoped he would destroy himself with memory. She built an entire environment for one purpose, to unmake his peace." I said nothing for a while. At last I asked, "And did she succeed?" Holmes did not look at me. "He survived, but he will not forget. Not again." And that, I understood, was the very verdict Miss Lorne had sought. There remained one thread Holmes had not yet pulled tight, though I sensed it weighed more heavily on him than any other. "It is a curious irony," he said, "that the only act of genuine cruelty in this entire tale came not from the one who wore a mask, but from the one who wore his name with pride." "You mean Featherstone?" "Yes, Watson," he replied with quiet gravity. "Let us lay aside the terror and the ghost play and return to its seed. A brother, fragile of mind, rendered voiceless, a reputation in ascension, an estate divided not by fairness, but by ambition." He stood and retrieved the asylum transcript again. Julian was not mad in the medical sense, not then. He was emotional, perhaps unstable, but he needed care, not confinement. "And his brother?" "Committed him," Holmes said. "Silently. No scandal, no public record, only quiet papers, a sanitarium in Kent, and a life filed away for the sake of lectures and university halls. It was, I confess, difficult to speak in that moment. For though Featherstone had not laid a hand upon Julian's death, he had paved the road towards it with indifference, and worse, with convenience. Holmes said no more for some time. When he did, his voice had regained its cool precision. In the end, he murmured, Miss Lorne only resurrected what he had tried to bury. And perhaps in doing so, she did what no justice system ever could. He did not need to say the word. Cowardice is its own sentence. Inspector Lestrade arrived the next morning, summoned by Holmes with a note that gave no more detail than strictly necessary. The matter, Holmes insisted, required discretion rather than parade. Lestrade listened with narrowed eyes as Holmes recounted the events, excluding no fact, but tempering every phrase with his usual clinical clarity. When Holmes finished, the inspector shook his head slowly. "A white cat and a rooftop ghost," he said. "You do find the strangest corners of London, Holmes." "And yet," Holmes replied, "you will find no gaps in the reasoning." Lestrade sighed. "No gaps. Just madness, executed with academic precision." He turned to me. "And the young lady?" "She will not resist," I said, "but I suspect you'll find her less criminal than theatrical." Lestrade nodded, then added with a shrug, "Well, I've seen men hang for less truth than this." And with that, he left, to collect not a villain, but a sorrow, dressed in white. After Lestrade's departure, Holmes stood by the window long after the footsteps faded. He did not speak. The pipe in his hand remained unlit, his gaze lost, not in the street below, but somewhere behind the fog of thought. "You're quiet," I said. He nodded slowly. "There are victories, Watson, which taste of ash." I waited, but he said no more. Only the fire spoke in its low, measured crackle. And in the stillness, I understood that even for Sherlock Holmes, man of logic, master of deduction, there were truths too complex for resolution, and ghosts too human to vanquish cleanly. 2 days later, Holmes proposed a walk through Hyde Park. The snow had not yet fallen, but winter had announced its dominion. The branches, stark against a pale grey sky, bore no leaves, only the echo of what had been. We walked without urgency, our steps muffled upon the frost-bitten paths, and for some time neither of us spoke. Holmes had always favoured these silent intervals after a case of psychological complexity, and I had long since learned not to disturb his thoughts until they chose to speak for themselves. At length, as we passed beneath a row of ash trees, Holmes broke the quiet. "Did you find her monstrous, Watson?" The question caught me off guard, though its weight had surely lingered unspoken between us. "No," I replied after a pause, "but I found her haunted." Holmes nodded faintly, his gaze still fixed forward. "There are crimes," he said, "that shout for justice, and others that whisper for understanding." He drew his coat tighter as the wind cut across the open path. "And there are those," he added, "that leave the courtroom behind altogether, and walk instead through the corridors of the mind." I said nothing further, but in my silence I heard every word. After some minutes I spoke again, this time not from curiosity, but from the inward pressure of unresolved thought. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe she meant to kill him? Or only to haunt?" He considered my question carefully, as if weighing not only the facts, but their meaning. "She stood at the top of the stairs," he said, "and watched him fall. Her hands were clean, but her silence was not." "Then you do believe it was deliberate?" "I believe it was inevitable," he replied. "She orchestrated fear, but fear is a knife with 1,000 edges, Watson. One may wield it without touching flesh." He paused. "To haunt a man so thoroughly that he topples from his own conscience. What does one call that, if not lethal intent clothed in innocence? I felt the cold more keenly in that moment, and yet I could not deny the truth of what he said. Holmes slowed his pace as we reached the edge of the Serpentine. The water lay still, save for the ripples of wind across its surface, like breath upon glass. "Most crimes, Watson, are born in a moment," he said. "A flare of temper, a sudden impulse, a desperate miscalculation. But not this." He turned slightly, his expression thoughtful. This was the slow crime, the one that germinates in silence, in the long private rehearsals of injury and injustice. I listened, struck as always by how Holmes could pull philosophy from the fibres of fact. "It is the silence that makes it dangerous," he continued. "Rage burns fast and leaves its mark, but a wound nursed in stillness. It seeps, Watson, it spreads, until one day it dons a mask and walks rooftops in the dark." I thought then of Miss Lorne's eyes behind the feline disguise, not wild, not mad, but focused, calculating. "She never shouted," Holmes murmured. "She never raised a hand, but she built an entire theatre from pain." We stood for a time by the water, and in the reflection of the sky, I saw not only the aftermath of a case, but the deeper, older truth Holmes had unearthed. That some crimes are quietest just before they are seen. As we walked on, my thoughts turned inward, drawn toward that uncertain boundary Holmes had so precisely described. The line between justice and vengeance. I thought of Beatrice Lorne, not as the spectral figure upon the roof, but as the woman who had carried her father's silence like an heirloom. What court could she appeal to for that loss? What law could weigh the weightless grief of erasure? And yet, even as I understood her, I could not absolve her. Her campaign had been cunning, her methods theatrical, her impact nearly fatal. She had chosen to haunt, not to heal, and in doing so, she had blurred the very thing she sought to restore. Featherstone's sins had been committed in silence, hers in shadow. And somewhere between them lay that flickering margin where the nobility of justice dims into the seduction of revenge. Perhaps that was why Holmes had not offered condemnation. Perhaps he had seen what I only now began to grasp, that her crime had been one of purpose, not pleasure. And yet, I could not shake the unease. For if vengeance can wear the cloak of righteousness, how easily might justice be led astray? Now, as I write these closing lines, I find myself returning not to the facts, but to the question that lingers still, one that no deduction can fully resolve. Did Beatrice Lorne fall because she sought vengeance, or because she misunderstood the very nature of truth? In uncovering her father's fate, she unearthed injustice, but in pursuing its echo, did she become captive to it? Did her obsession with memory lead her away from reality and into a performance she could no longer end? Sherlock Holmes, for all his precision, did not answer that, nor perhaps could he. But I leave the matter to you, dear reader. What do you believe was Beatrice Lorne's greatest mistake? Was it underestimating Holmes? Or was it something deeper still, the tragic misbelief that truth, when sharpened into retribution, could restore the dead? You have walked with us through rooftops and recollections, through the shadows of guilt and the masks of grief. Now I invite you to share your thoughts. What did you make of Miss Lorne's choices? Where does your sympathy rest, and your judgment? Leave your reflections below. We read every one, and should you wish to journey with Holmes and myself again into the strange, the sorrowful, and the unsolved, then subscribe to this chronicle and share it with those who, like you, find meaning in the mystery. Until next time, dear reader, we remain, yours at Baker Street, Dr. John H. Watson. We had returned to Baker Street, the case now behind us, and the hearth casting its quiet glow across Holmes's expression. He sat with steepled fingers, and a gaze fixed not on the fire, but on something far more distant. There is a cruelty, he said at last, in the silence that follows betrayal. It seeps not with fury, but with resolve, and from such resolve are the most calculated crimes born. I nodded slowly. And yet she never raised a hand in violence. Holmes glanced at me, nor did she need to. Fear, Watson, is often more precise than any blade. What do you think was Beatrice's greatest misstep? Her belief that revenge would grant peace, or her failure to foresee how Holmes would unmask a ghost? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this journey through shadows and deduction, be sure to subscribe for more of our adventures and share this tale with a fellow mystery lover. Until next time.